Hello and welcome back to another tutorial. My name is Jennifer and you can find me on Ravelry as Lindria or on Instagram as Lindria Knits. And today I'm going to show you how to do a folded cuff on a sock. The same technique can be used to do a folded brim on a hat. And why does a person want to do a folded brim? Honestly, it's just a design choice. Now I did it on this colorwork sock so that I could have colorwork on the cuff of the sock. You do not need to use it with colorwork. Again, it's just a design choice and an option. You can make a folded cuff or folded brim and just have it plain. It's totally up to you. Anyway, so let's get started. Now, a folded cuff is double thick. So what happens is we cast on and then we knit a certain amount of rounds, whatever your pattern calls for or however long you want your cuff to be. And then we turn and then we knit some more and then we join that cast on edge. We fold it inward, we join it, and then we continue on with our sock. Now before I get into the video, I just want to apologize if there's any shaking. I've tried to make everything as stable as possible, but occasionally if I hit the table too much, there's a little bit of shaking, and I'm going to try to avoid that, but I really need a better setup, and I hope to get that in the future, but I'm doing the best I can right now. Okay, so there are different ways to cast on for a folded cuff. One of the common ways you may see is doing a provisional cast on. I'm not going to do that today. If you would rather do a provisional cast on, go right ahead, find another video, and it'll show you how to do that. But I'm just going to show you a really easy way where you don't have to worry about any of that. I'm going to do a backwards loop cast on. Now, can you do other cast ons like a long tail or German twist and cast on? You can do whatever you want. It's going to be on the inside of the sock. I'm just doing a backwards loop cast on. Now, it has come to my attention that people teach backwards loop cast on different ways. This first way that I'm showing you is one way that I've seen it done. And then some people twist the yarn in the other direction, like this. So I am not going to tell you which way you should do yours today in this video. You can decide that for yourself. The only thing I will say is if you do it the first way that I showed you, when you go in later on to knit each of these stitches, you're just going to end up with, I think, a little extra twist at the bottom, whereas if you do it the second way that I did, there'll be less twist at the bottom. Is there a reason to do it one way over another? Maybe, but I'm not going to get into that today. Now I'm going to continue casting on the first way because that's just how I did it on the other sock and it works pretty well. So now you just cast on the number of stitches that it calls for in your pattern. And I will come back when I've got those cast on. Okay, I've got all of my stitches cast on and I'm going to knit these on magic loop. You can knit these on whatever needles you want. It doesn't change what you're doing. So I've just divided my stitches in half. So I've got half on the front and half on the back. Now, you can use a removable stitch marker if you want to mark the first stitch on your first needle by going into the bottom, like this little loop right at the bottom between the stitches. But I actually don't do this because I just use the tail as the marker to find that first stitch later on. But you can do what you think would be most helpful for you. As always, when you're joining in the round, make sure all of your stitches are going in the same direction with the bottom at the bottom and nothing is twisted around the needles. And then this back yarn is coming off the back underneath and then up between those two stitches. And you see how it's pulling here at the end? That's not going to matter, and I'm going to show you why in a little bit when I get there. So I just start knitting, and you're going to knit every stitch for the first part of this cuff. Now remember, then the first part of this cuff is going to be on the inside of the sock. So you can do it in a different yarn color if you want. It doesn't even have to be the color that's going to show on the outside later on. If you want to switch to the color that's going to show on the outside later on, you would do it probably a few rounds before you do the row that becomes the turn where you fold the cuff. So then if you peek inside the cuff, it won't be immediately noticeable that it's a different color, but maybe you want it to be noticeable that it's a different color. Again, that's entirely up to you. So I'm just going to continue knitting these stitches, and I'll show you what it's like when I come to the end of this row with what looks like extra yarn. That extra yarn is actually just kind of going to disappear, and it's not going to be an issue. So I will come back when I get there. Okay, so I'm getting to the last few cast on stitches of this round, and if you're working on multiple needles, or even if you're working on a, let's say a 9-inch circular, you might notice this happening at the end of the round. It may start feeling a little bit tight to get in there. So what I do is I just poke my needle in there any way I can, and I pull up, and then I hold it so it doesn't go back, and then I can put my needle in from the front a little bit more easily. Sometimes I have to be careful that I'm not splitting the yarn. And again, I just kind of poke that in there any way I can, pull it out of it, and then go in and knit it. And then I'm on the last one here. Okay, so that's that long piece of yarn, but all you're going to do is you're going to do what I was doing. You're just going to get your needle in there. And you're going to pull it out a bit so that you can get your, you're just going to pull that out a bit, and it kind of uses up some of that extra yarn. And again, the next stitch might be tight when you're switching needles. Just pull it out again and go into it. And as that happens, you're using up some of that extra yarn. And it doesn't really matter anyway, because this is going to be on the inside of the sock, and this cast on edge is actually going to be pulled out a lot anyway, because cast on edge does not become your first row of stitches. It literally is just the cast on edge. Now, once I redistributed that extra yarn a little bit, it becomes a little bit easier to continue. So I'm still in my first round, and I'm going to finish this round and knit the second round, and then I'm going to come back and show you what it looks like and tell you how to count the rows when you're knitting this way with the backwards loop cast on, because it's a slightly different than if you had done a type of long tail cast on. Okay, so I have now knit 2 rounds, and I'm going to show you what this looks like. Hopefully you can see this if I pull it out. Can you see how there is one row of these below the stitches that are currently on the needles? So that first row of these was the first round that I knit. And my second round that I knit are the stitches that are currently on the needle. So this is 2 rounds. This is a little bit different from a long tail cast on like the German twisted cast on or just your standard long tail cast on. With those cast ons, you're creating the cast on edge plus kind of like the first round of stitches all at once, because when you go in and you knit those stitches, they stay there and they become visible. So if this had been a long tail cast on, this is what it would have looked like after knitting one round. When you knit the first round after using a long tail type of cast on, you see this one row of V's beneath the needles after just the first round. This is 2 rounds because the loops that were on your needles after doing the backwards loop cast on just become part of the cast on edge, and they stretch out a lot and they disappear. They do not become the first round of stitches. And that's why this cast on actually stretches out quite a bit. So just to be clear, I've now knit the 3rd round. I'm going to stretch the edge out so you can see what it looks like. Okay, so I've knit the 3rd round, and hopefully you can see here there are now 2 rows of V's below the needle, plus the stitches that are on the needle. That is what 3 rounds look like after doing a backwards loop cast on. So you count both 1, 2, and then 3. And again, this is different from a long tail cast on, where you don't count the ones below the needle and the ones on the needle. What I normally do when using any type of long tail cast on, I just count the rows of V's below the needle to get my round count. Okay, so now you're going to continue knitting for as many rounds as it says to in your pattern, or for as long as you like your cuff. Let's say you normally like a 20 round cuff. You're going to continue until you have 20 rounds, and that would end up being 19 rounds of V's below your needle plus the stitches on the needle for this particular method. I'm going to come back when I have the first half of my cuff knit. Okay, so I've knit the first part of the cuff. This is the part that's going to be on the inside. Now I'm going to do 1 purl round. And this purl round is going to make it super easy later on to fold this cuff inside, because it's going to fold right at that purl round. And I think it gives it a very nice, neat look for the cuff of a sock or the brim of a hat. So those purls is going to be the first thing you see at the top of the cuff. This is the purl round right there at the top. So I will just continue to knit my purl round, and after that purl round, you go back to knitting all of your stitches, and you will do the same number of knit rounds after this purl round as you did before the purl round. So let's say you're knitting a sock and you did those 20 rounds before the purl round. Then you will also do 20 knit rounds after the purl round before joining the 2 edges together. But your pattern will tell you how many rounds it is. Just remember, it's going to be the same number of knit rounds after the purl round as it is before. And then you're all good. So I will meet up with you again once I've knit the second half of the cuff. And the second half of the cuff is what's going to show on the outside of the sock. So for me, since the outside of my cuff is color work, I'll be working this section of color work before I come back and show you how to join the 2 ends together. Okay, I am back. I've finished knitting the cuff, but there's one very important step that you must do before joining the cast on edge with your current edge, and that is to weave in any ends that you have. So you're going to have your cast on end to weave in, and then if you are not using the cuff color in the rest of the sock, you will need to cut that and weave that in. If you're continuing on with the same color, you only have the one end to weave in. Now for me, I'm going to be joining in a different color. I'm going to get out the purple here in a second, but I do not need the red anymore. So I'm going to give that a snip. So I'm going to weave in both of these red ends. So I am using the light pink in the next section, so I'm going to be keeping that attached. But if you added any colors during your cuff, like this light pink, you're going to need to weave in that end too. So I have 3 ends to weave in. I will be back to show you how to join after I do that. Okay, my ends are woven in, and now comes the fun part. So you're just going to take the first part of the cuff unit and push that down inside, and you'll find that it folds pretty easily at that purl row. Now you're going to look at the sock like you would normally, but you need to pull up that first cuff. Now, remember how I said I used that end as a marker? I left a little bit, okay, so I can still see where that end was. It's like right here. So that's going to be my first column. Yes, I wove it in, but I can still tell where that first column is. And so what we're going to be doing is we're going to be picking up these like little tiny loops right on the cast on edge. Okay, so you may be joining with the same color, or you may be joining with a different color. I'm using a different color because that's how my pattern is here. And I think it'll make it a little easier to show you what's going on. Okay, so for the first couple stitches, it's a little tricky, but after that it gets very easy. So you just go in like you would to knit normally. But then, whoops, so it popped out. Apparently that might happen. Just push it back in again. Okay, I'm not even going to try to keep the whole thing in at the moment. I'm just going to hold the stitches up. Okay, so you go into the first stitch like you would to knit and leave your needle there. And now you have to find the first stitch. If you had that stitch marker there, you would be going into the stitch that your stitch marker marked. But see, this is the cast on edge, the end that I wove in, but I can tell like right here, like that is the first column. So I'm just going to go under that loop on the edge. It can be a little tricky on the first couple, the first one especially. It's just a lot to hang on to, especially when this yarn isn't attached. Okay, I'm just gonna try to pull it through the back one first. You know what? I'm gonna use this needle. So I'm leaving that first stitch on the other needle, so I can use this needle to help it through that first red stitch. I think this is actually easier, maybe, to make sense since all these stitches are different colors. All right, so I pulled the purple one through, and then I'm pulling it through that first stitch. But it gets a lot easier, I promise. Okay, go into the second stitch, go into the second loop on the edge, and it's just one strand I'm going into. And then, again, that second one's a little bit tricky, so I'm going to use my left-hand needle to pull it through. Okay, and then you just kind of poke it into an edge stitch. You know what? Once you get it started, I pull it through the back loop and then pull it through the front loop. Put it in the front loop, go into that edge stitch, pull it through the back loop, and then pull it through the front loop. Go into the front loop, go into the next edge stitch, pull it through that, and then pull it through that. I've never actually broken it down before, but apparently that's what I normally do. So it's a little bit easier for me to pull it through the loops separately. Pull it through the back and then pull it through the front. Find your next edge stitch, pull it through the back one, and then pull it through the front stitch. And as you can see, they're getting stitched up all nicely together. Pull it through the back and then the front. Go into the front. Pick up a loop in the back. Pull it through the back. Pull it through the front. And then you just keep doing that. Now, what happens if, say, on your inner edge, you end up with like one too many loops or one too few loops? Like maybe you dropped a stitch or added a stitch at some point and you did fix it along the way, but your cast on edge may have a stitch more or a stitch less. Just fudge it. If you have too few, go into the same loop twice at some point. If you have one too many, go into two of the loops in the back, like you were knitting two together. It's going to be on the inside and no one will ever know. Go into the back loop, pull it through the back, pull it through the front, go into the front, go into the back, pull through back, pull through front. And this is why I use the backwards loop cast on, because it's pretty easy to find a loop on the edge every single time. Because it might not show up too well in the video, but I promise in person it's a lot easier to see. Okay, so I've got a nice start there. You can see it's closing up very nicely. It looks almost like it's being sewn together. You can see that row of purple stitches in the back there. And then you just continue around the cuff until you've closed it all up, and then you continue on with your sock as normal. So I hope you enjoy learning and practicing this technique.